Hello, everyone. My name is John O'Callahan. I'm an aeronautical engineer at the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. I've been with the NTSB since about 1997, and I'll be speaking to you this afternoon about how the NTSB uses simulation to help determine the cause of aircraft accidents. My presentation will be in two parts. Since not everybody might be familiar with the National Transportation Safety Board and its mission, I'd first like to introduce the agency and how it promotes transportation safety through accident investigations and safety recommendations. Then I'll discuss three levels or tiers of flight simulation that the NTSB uses to support aircraft accident investigations. The three tiers differ in the number of elements of a full flight simulator that they exercise. The top tier involves the use of full flight pilot training simulators themselves. The second tier uses engineering simulations that run without pilot involvement. And the third tier consists of simple graphical animations of accidents using popular simulator software like X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Simulator. I'll illustrate these three levels of simulation using four different NTSB investigations as examples. But first, a few slides about the NTSB itself. The mission of the NTSB is to improve transportation safety by determining the causes of accidents and issuing safety recommendations to prevent similar accidents. The NTSB also adjudicates enforcement action appeals from aviators and mariners. For example, a pilot whose license is revoked or suspended by the FAA for breaking a regulation can appeal to the NTSB. The NTSB is charged by Congress to investigate every civil aviation accident in the United States. This includes general aviation, airliners, helicopters, and even home builds. The military investigates their own accidents. In the case of a midair collision between an F-16 and a Cessna 150 that I'll discuss later, both the Air Force and the NTSB conducted separate, independent investigations, since both military and civilian aircraft were involved. The NTSB is not mandated to investigate all accidents in other transportation modes, but is mandated to investigate significant accidents in those modes. Significant railroad accidents investigated by the NTSB, and pictured here, are the 2017 derailment of an Amtrak passenger train in DuPont, Washington, the 2009 collision between two Washington Metro light rail trains, and the 2013 derailment and fire of a BNSF freight train transporting crude oil near Castleton, North Dakota. Significant highway accidents investigated by the NTSB include the 2019 collision between a pickup truck and several motorcycles in Randolph, New Hampshire, the 2018 collision of a Tesla Model X with a concrete barrier while on autopilot in Mountain View, California, and the 2015 collision between an amphibious passenger vehicle, also known as a duck boat, and a motor coach in Seattle, Washington. Significant marine accidents investigated by the NTSB, include the 2015 sinking of the cargo ship El Faro during Hurricane Joaquin in the Caribbean Sea, the 2019 fire aboard the dive boat Conception south of Santa Barbara, California, and the 2015 sinking of the towing vessel Spence in the Caribbean, north of Cartagena, Colombia. Perhaps the most spectacular pipeline accident investigated by the NTSB is the 2010 Pacific Gas and Electric natural gas pipeline rupture and fire in San Bruno, California, that destroyed 38 homes, damaged 70, and killed 8 people. The ruptured pipe that released the gas is pictured here. In each of these modes, the NTSB is charged with determining the probable cause of the accidents and issuing safety recommendations to prevent similar accidents in the future. The NTSB publishes its findings and recommendations in the final reports of each accident, which are available on the agency's website. Safety recommendations are also communicated to the recipients of the recommendations directly. In addition to conducting accident investigations and issuing safety recommendations, the NTSB conducts special studies concerning transportation safety. For example, the NTSB recently released a safety study concerning the prevention of turbulence-related injuries in air carrier operations. Finally, the NTSB also coordinates the resources of the federal government and other organizations to help accident victims and their families. I'll now briefly describe how the NTSB is organized and how it conducts aviation accident investigations. The board is comprised of a chairman, a vice chairman, and 3 members that are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They serve for 3 to 5 year terms and can be renominated any number of times. The board members speak for the agency and deliberate over the accident reports and recommendations proposed by the NTSB career investigative staff. These staff are grouped into offices corresponding to each mode of transportation, plus an Office of Research and Engineering, which supports the modal offices with technical expertise and conducts safety studies. At the end of an investigation, the staff will present a final report containing a proposed probable cause of the accident and proposed findings and recommendations to the board at a publicly held board meeting. A picture of such a meeting before COVID is shown here. The board members are on the dais, the NTSB staff are seated at the tables to the left, and the public are seated facing the board. At the board meeting, the board asks the staff clarifying questions about the content of the proposed report and recommendations, deliberates over these matters, and votes to adopt the report and recommendations as proposed or with amendments discussed during the meeting. Aviation investigations generally are of 2 kinds, depending on their scope. Major investigations, such as those of serious airline accidents, usually prompt a GO team launch from NTSB headquarters in Washington. In these investigations, an investigator in charge, or IIC, leads an interdisciplinary team of experts called group chairman, each of whom addresses a specific aspect of the investigation. A board member might also launch to the scene with the GO team. Smaller general aviation accidents are usually investigated by a single IIC from the NTSB region where the accident occurred. Disciplinary experts based at NTSB headquarters can assist the regional IICs remotely as required. Accident investigations require access to specific and detailed knowledge and data about aircraft, systems, and operations. Consequently, the NTSB relies heavily on the assistance of parties to the investigation who can provide this information. This chart outlines the relationships between the IIC, the group chairman, and the parties in an aviation accident investigation. The NTSB group chairmen are the leaders of the group disciplines listed on the right and report to the IIC. The parties are listed on the left and provide qualified members to assist each of the group chairmen in their respective discipline. Parties only need to assign members to those group disciplines in which they have expertise and can contribute productively. Aircraft simulation work addressing the physics of flight and the performance of the airplane takes place within the Aircraft Performance Group. The Aircraft Performance Group also provides technical support to the operations and human performance groups when piloted simulations are used to address operational and human performance questions. The parties that usually support simulation work are the airframe manufacturer, the operator, the pilot union, and the FAA. Note that the FAA is required by regulation to be a party to NTSB investigations. As mentioned, the NTSB staff's investigation culminates in a final report that presents the facts gathered during the investigation, analyzes those facts, and proposes findings, the probable cause of the accident, and safety recommendations. The proposed final report is presented to the board members for their deliberation at the board meeting. Note that near the end of the investigation, parties are invited to deliver submissions to the board in which they propose their own findings, probable cause, and safety recommendations for the board's consideration. There is much more information about an investigation available to the public besides the content of the final report. The docket for each accident contains detailed group chairman factual reports and aircraft performance and simulation studies, as well as copies of the flight data recorder, surveillance, and other electronic information. You can search for and access the dockets for NTSB investigations from the links shown here. If you want to take a picture of that slide, please feel free to do so. Okay, we're now finally ready to talk about the use of simulation in accident investigations. The different ways simulation can be used in accident investigation are differentiated by the elements of a simulation that they exercise. Consequently, to understand the differences, it is useful to review the elements of and the computational flow in a simulation. We can then identify 3 levels or tiers of simulation. From most to least complex, these are, first, full flight simulators, which exercise all the elements of a simulation, including the physical models, visual displays, and motion system, and pilot flight controls and other interfaces. Second, engineering desktop simulations that only exercise the physical modeling elements without a visual display or a pilot interface. And third, backdrive simulations and animations that only exercise the output elements of a simulation, such as the visual display, motion system, and cockpit instruments, without computing anything using the physical models. I'll describe these 3 tiers of simulation in more detail and exemplify each using 4 past NTSB investigations. These investigations are US Airways Flight 1549, also known as the Miracle on the Hudson, a 2017 Pilatus PC-12 takeoff accident in Amarillo, Texas, American Airlines Flight 587, and a midair collision between an F-16 fighter jet and a Cessna 150. Finally, I'll describe how Flight Simulator 10, or FSX, can be used to animate aviation accidents and point out some features of the FS Recorder add-on for FSX that make this task quick and easy. I'll also make an appeal to developers to recreate the functionality of FS Recorder for the 2020 version of Microsoft Flight Simulator. This slide is a simplified illustration of the computational flow in a Tier 1 full flight simulator. We start with the human pilot seated in a simulator cab. The pilot makes flight control and throttle inputs and manipulates other items in the cab, such as the flap or gear handles. These inputs, together with required information about the atmosphere and environment, are processed by the numerous mathematical, aerodynamics, and systems models of the simulation to compute, to compute system behavior and the forces and moments acting on the aircraft. The equations of motion are then solved to yield aircraft and system states, such as position, speed, attitude, and configuration. Finally, these outputs are presented to the pilot through the simulator cab visual, audio, and motion systems, instrument displays, and flight control forces. In a Tier 2 desktop simulation, the flight control and other inputs normally generated by a human pilot have been replaced by computer code and/or pre-existing data, such as information from a flight data recorder. Similarly, the simulation's solution for the aircraft and system states is not presented to a pilot through a visual display or cockpit instruments, but is saved to a data file or plotted on a computer screen. In short, this is a simulation by engineers for engineers. A Tier 3 simulation is not really a simulation at all, but merely a media player for predefined data. We can distinguish 2 types of Tier 3 simulations depending on the sophistication of the media player involved. A backdrive simulation involves all the elements of a simulator cab, and so this media player can drive multiple channels: the cab visual display, motion system, cockpit instruments, and flight controls. Each of these channels is fed by predefined data obtained from a flight data recorder or computed some other way. An animation, on the other hand, only involves one channel of data, a visual display. The display can depict either an internal cockpit view from the pilot's seat or an external view of the aircraft from a chase plane. Note that animations can be created with general purpose 3D modeling software, and the NTSB creates animations in this way for investigations in all transportation modes, not just aviation. However, this method can be very time-consuming, whereas aviation accidents can be animated quickly and easily using flight simulation software such as X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Simulator. I'd now like to illustrate the three simulation tiers using examples from past NTSB investigations. The investigations of US Airways Flight 1549 is an example of the NTSB's use of Tier 1 full flight simulators. On January 15, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320, lost almost all thrust in both engines after striking a flock of geese about 2 minutes after departing from LaGuardia Airport in New York. The flight crew ditched the airplane in the Hudson River about 3.5 minutes after the bird strike. The 150 passengers and 5 crew members evacuated the airplane via the forward and overwing exits. 1 flight attendant and 4 passengers were seriously injured, and the airplane was substantially damaged. A security video captured the touchdown. During the ditching, the aft fuselage was breached, resulting in water entering the cabin and submerging the aft door sills, making the aft life rafts unusable. As a result, there was insufficient raft space available for all the passengers, and some passengers had to stand on the wings of the airplane to await rescue. As will be described later, one objective of the Tier 1 simulations was to evaluate the feasibility of achieving the touchdown conditions required to avoid a breach of the fuselage. The Flight 1549 simulation tests were conducted using both a motion-based training simulator and a fixed-base engineering simulator at Airbus. 2 simulator exercises were evaluated. The first consisted of attempting to glide back to a runway, using both an immediate turn to the runway following the bird strike and a turn delayed by 35 seconds to account for crew reaction and decision time. It should be noted that the purpose of this exercise was not to second guess the crew's decision to ditch the airplane in the Hudson River, rather than to attempt to glide to a runway. Instead, the purpose was to determine whether landing on a runway was even possible, a question that would certainly be asked both within and outside of the investigation. The second simulator exercise evaluated the operational feasibility of achieving a touchdown flight path angle no steeper than minus 0.5 degrees, which is required to prevent a breach of the aft fuselage and water penetration into the cabin. The actual flight path angle at touchdown in the accident was minus 3.4 degrees. The results of the first simulator exercise indicated that a glide to a runway was only successful when the decision to turn towards that runway was made and executed immediately after the bird strike, vindicating the flight crew's decision to ditch the airplane in the river. The results of the second exercise are shown in this graph, which depicts the touchdown flight path angles achieved by each of 4 pilots at different flap settings. The normal landing category corresponds to a normal landing on a runway instead of a ditching in the water. Note that in both configurations 2 and 3, none of the pilots achieved a touchdown flight path angle shallower than the minus 0.5 degree target. The accident ditching was flown in configuration 2. Moving to our second accident, the investigation of the crash of a Pilatus PC-12 shortly after takeoff is an example of the NTSB's use of Tier 2 desktop simulations. On April 28, 2017, a few minutes before midnight, a Pilatus PC-12 airplane impacted terrain shortly after departing from Amarillo International Airport in Amarillo, Texas. The instrument meteorological conditions prevailed at the time, and the airplane was operating on an IFR flight plan as an air ambulance flight. The airline transport pilot and 2 medical crew were fatally injured, and the airplane was destroyed. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the pilot's loss of airplane control due to spatial disorientation during the initial climb after takeoff in night instrument meteorological conditions and moderate turbulence. A simulation of the accident was performed in order to generate a flight trajectory that is consistent with the recorded radar data and the crash site location and the performance capabilities of the airplane. The simulation uses a math pilot to generate flight control and throttle inputs that result in an approximate match of the target trajectory defined by the radar data and the impact point. As shown in this figure, the simulation track matches the radar track quite well. This figure shows that the simulation altitude matches the recorded radar altitude, and that the airplane reached an altitude of a little over 2,400 feet above ground level before suddenly descending into the ground. This figure shows the column and wheel forces the simulator math pilot required to match the radar trajectory. During the investigation, a concern was raised that the roll control forces might have become very large during portions of the flight. The dashed orange lines in the plots depict the one-hand short-term force limits prescribed by the certification standards for small airplanes. The dashed red lines show the two-hand short-term force limits. The bottom plot shows that the wheel forces are within the one-hand short-term force limits, except during the last 8 seconds of the flight. Hence, the simulation helped to determine that heavy wheel forces were not a factor in the accident. The investigation of American Airlines Flight 587 is another example of the NTSB's use of Tier 2 desktop simulations. On November 12, 2001, American Airlines Flight 587, an Airbus A320, crashed into a residential area of Bell Harbor, New York, shortly after takeoff from John F. Kennedy International Airport. Following an encounter with the wake from a Boeing 747 that was ahead of Flight 587, the first officer, who was flying the airplane, made a series of back and forth rudder pedal inputs, or rudder reversals, that led to the aerodynamic overloading and separation of the airplane's vertical stabilizer and a subsequent loss of control. All 260 people aboard the airplane and 5 people on the ground were killed, and the airplane was destroyed. This is an animation of the accident. This animation was not created with Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane, but with legacy animation software called FlightViz. The top part of the animation depicts an external chase plane view of the airplane. Text depicting cockpit voice recorder information is also displayed here. The bottom part of the animation depicts the attitude indicator, column and wheel inputs, vertical and lateral accelerations, and rudder pedal and rudder surface positions. The airplane encounters the wake from the 747 twice. In the first encounter, the pilot responds only with wheel and column inputs. In the second, he responds with wheel, column, and rudder pedal. The rudder reversals produced excessive aerodynamic loads on the vertical stabilizer that broke it off the airplane. These kinds of rudder inputs are well outside the design criteria of transport category airplanes. Airbus used a desktop simulation to approximately match the motions of the airplane recorded on the flight data recorder. The simulation used the thrust and flight control inputs recorded on the FDR, as well as wind gusts tailored to produce the best match of the airplane's Euler angles, that is, pitch, roll, and heading, as well as altitude, position, and load factors. The NTSB also performed a desktop simulation of the accident by incorporating A300 simulator models provided by Airbus into its own simulation engine. Like the Airbus simulation, the NTSB simulation was driven with the FDR flight controls and tailored wind gusts, but also incorporated external pitching, rolling, and yawing moments to account for additional effects of the 747 wake and force a better match of the recorded Euler angles. After a good match was obtained, the NTSB simulation was repeated, keeping the wind gusts and external moments attributable to the wake the same, but holding the flight controls at their initial trim positions. This second simulation quantified the effects of the wake by itself on the airplane's motions and helped to distinguish the relative importance of the 747 wake effects and the first officer's flight control inputs on the vertical stabilizer loads. The results of the NTSB desktop simulation are shown here. The simulation driven by both the FDR flight controls and the wake effects is shown on the left, and the simulation driven with the wake effects only is shown on the right. The plots compare the simulation pitch, roll, and heading angles with the angles recorded on the FDR. The simulation driven by both the flight controls and the wake effects matches the FDR Euler angles quite well. However, the simulation driven with the wake effects alone shows much smaller deviations in pitch, roll, and most significantly, heading. These results indicate that the large heading swings and the associated large side slip angles and loads on the vertical stabilizer were primarily the result of the first officer's flight control inputs and not of the wake encounter. The encounter prompted the pilot's control inputs, but in itself was relatively benign. In addition to the Tier 2 desktop simulations just described, the NTSB also used a Tier 3 backdrive simulation in its investigation of the Flight 587 accident. This backdrive was implemented in NASA's Vertical Motion Simulator, or VMS. The VMS was selected because it can develop larger and more sustained load factors than the hexapod motion-based systems typically used with full flight training simulators. Investigators wanted to recreate the load factors experienced by the accident crew as closely as possible in order to better understand how these loads might have affected the first officer's reactions on the flight controls. The VMS motion system was driven so as to duplicate, within limits, the load factors recorded on the FDR. In addition, the VMS visual scene, instrument displays, and flight controls were driven with information based on the FDR. Participants even listened to synchronized cockpit voice recorder audio over headsets. The VMS cab did not duplicate the cockpit of an A300, and so flight information was displayed to the participants using generic instrument displays. The participants concluded that, quote, the VMS, while constrained by limitations, provided insight and was a beneficial tool for experiencing time-synchronized motions, flight control motions, and displays as opposed to just looking at tabular or charted data. Moving to our fourth accident, the investigation of a midair collision between an F-16 and a Cessna 150 is an example of how the NTSB used FSX to create animations of the cockpit views from each airplane prior to the collision. The collision occurred on July 7th, 2015 near Moncks Corner, South Carolina. The F-16 was in contact with air traffic control, but the Cessna was not. The controller noticed the airplanes converging and instructed the F-16 pilot to turn south. Unfortunately, this maneuver turned the F-16 into the flight path of the Cessna, and the airplanes collided. The pilot and passenger of the Cessna died, and the F-16 pilot ejected with minor injuries. I'll next show you the animations created using FSX. The first animation is the view from the F-16 pilot's point of view. The semi-transparent gray areas in the scene depict the cockpit structure of the airplane. Points in the scene behind this gray area would be obscured from the pilot's view. These gray areas were defined by laser scans of an exemplar F-16. The audio you'll hear in the animation is the actual ATC recording. The animation starts with the controller's turn instruction to the F-16 pilot.
41 traffic, 12 o'clock, 2 miles, opposite direction, 1,200 indicated, type unknown. 41 turn west, heading 180 if you don't have that traffic. The 41 is, you don't have that traffic in sight, turn left, heading 180 immediately. That's 41 traffic passing below you, 1,400. 41.
This is the animation of the view from the Cessna. The animation contains no audio because the Cessna was not in contact with ATC. However, a transcript of the controller's communications with the F-16 is depicted above the visual scene for reference. Also, 2 simulation screens are joined together in this animation to provide a wider field of view. Let's see, is it playing? Oh, sorry, it wasn't playing. There it goes. Yes, sorry, that didn't play. Now it's going. So again, this is an animation of the view from the Cessna, and it's got no audio because he wasn't in contact with ATC, but the communications with the F-16 is shown above the screen there. Also, 2 simulation screens are joined together in this animation to provide a wider field of view. The views out of the front windshield and left window are shown. Again, the semi-transparent gray areas define the cockpit structure and are based on laser scans of an exemplar airplane. To create these animations in FSX, the position and attitude of the user's airplane in an AI airplane as a function of time are driven with data defined outside of FSX and imported into FSX through the FS Recorder add-on developed by Matthias Nusinger. The key feature of this add-on is that it allows the aircraft data to be defined by the user in a text file that is then converted into a binary file readable by FSS Recorder using an app provided with the add-on. Adjustments or offsets to the positions and attitudes defined in the file can be applied at runtime. FS Recorder can drive the data for the user's aircraft as well as many AI aircraft simultaneously, which is required to animate mid-air collisions. Importantly, the add-on also allows for robust playback control, including the playback direction and speed, and also allows the playback to be looped around an area of interest, such as the moments before a collision. The playback can be rendered to a video file so that the resulting animation can be edited further and easily shared. In addition, FSS Recorder contains options for placing custom cameras in FSX so that the playback can be viewed from viewpoints defined by the user. I've looked in vain for an add-on for the 2020 version of Microsoft Flight Simulator that provides the same functionality as FS Recorder. I did find products that contain a subset of the FS Recorder functions, but not a complete solution. If somebody knows of an FS Recorder equivalent containing all or most of the functionality described here, please let me know. This concludes the NTSB simulation examples I have for you. To summarize the overall presentation, the NTSB is a federal agency charged by Congress with investigating the cause of all civil aviation accidents and significant accidents in other transportation modes. The NTSB advances transportation safety by issuing safety recommendations developed through its investigations and safety studies that are intended to prevent future accidents. The NTSB uses flight simulation to help analyze and understand the aircraft performance and human performance aspects of aviation accidents. This presentation identified 3 tiers of simulation, differentiated by the elements of a full flight simulator exercised by each. Animations created with popular simulator software such as X-Plane and FSX can communicate the circumstances of an accident to a wide audience very effectively. It would be nice to create animations using the spectacular graphics inherent in the 2020 version of Microsoft Flight Simulator, but doing so requires the development of an add-on incorporating the functionality that FSS Recorder provides in FSX. Developers, that sound you hear is opportunity knocking. Thank you. This concludes my presentation. And so now I think I have a few minutes left, about 7 or so. So I'll be happy to take any questions if you'd like to submit those through the Journey app there. And I'll refresh my screen here and I see it looks like there's one. Okay, the question here, it says, with the upcoming surge, oh, this is submitted by Christian Arevalo, okay? With the upcoming surge in private space flights in the next years, will the NTSB be charged by Congress to investigate accidents in that new scope? And the answer is yes, that's already the case. And a matter of fact, I myself participated in the NTSB investigation of Virgin Galactic's test flight of Spaceship Two that occurred, I think it was 2014, if I'm remembering right. So Congress has said that yes, the NTSB will investigate accidents, mishaps that occur on commercial space flights. One other thing I'll just add to that is, and certainly I think anything carrying a passenger, we would be involved regardless, but we're also charged, for example, if God forbid SpaceX were to have an accident with a cargo ship, even we would investigate that as well if debris from the rocket were to fall outside a designated safety area. So for these rocket launches, there is a safety area defined where they can destroy the rocket as a precaution, or if there's a mishap, it can come apart. But as long as all the debris falls within that safety area, then the NTSB would not get involved in the investigation. Probably the operator would investigate it themselves. But if debris does fall outside that area, then the NTSB would get involved. And certainly with people flying, if there's somebody flying on a commercial space flight as a tourist and something were to happen, I'm pretty sure our rules are that NTSB would investigate. Okay, so that's that one. I got 5 minutes left. I'll refresh the questions if there are any. Here's another one. That's the same one. Okay. So, all right, I'll just see if there's another question that pops up here in the next minute or so. Otherwise, I'll thank you all for your participant attention and your questions. I see there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat. Maybe I should look at that. William Lehman says, I'm not sure if you have seen this app, Mr. O'Callahan, but it is a flight recorder for MS 2020 that replays the entire flight, allowing you to change views, pause, etc. Flight to sim to file, flight sim to file. Okay, well, thank you. I have not heard of that. I know there's some apps out there that will replay your flight as you're flying it. Like you fly your flight, and then that's recorded, and you can replay the flight you just flew. A lot of F's there. Yeah, the key functionality I need though is for it to read a file defined by the user. Like I just write a data file to a text file. So maybe I'll check out your link there and see if that capability is in there. So thank you, Mr. Lehman. Thank you, William. So this here, flight gear MATLAB can be used for playback. Yes. Yeah, we have a custom written simulation program that we use for those desktop engineering type simulations that I described in the presentation, that is written in MATLAB, but it doesn't have the nice graphics and terrain modeling and so on and so forth that FSX or X-Plane would have. X-Plane does have that FDR playback recorder capability, but when I want to do multiple airplanes for midairs, I've found that FS recorder is really hard to beat. Okay, I'll do the refresh one more time. Oh, here are a bunch of them. Okay. Submitted by Ethan. Okay, Ethan Long asks, has the NTSB ever been called in to investigate a domestic crash that they haven't been able to recover or find traces of? Well, I'm gonna say that when an airplane goes missing, which sounds like this is, we'll be notified and we'll have somebody standing by. But I think they won't launch until they actually find the wreckage. Now, if they never find the wreckage, what will happen? I'll have to get back to you. I have to research that. I think maybe they might do some kind of an investigation with surveillance data, radar, ADSB. But until they find a wreck, there's not much we can do generally. Now, the one famous example of that is MH370, which wasn't an NTSB investigation, but the whole world was analyzed satellite data very, very carefully to try to figure out where that one went. But I'll research that, and maybe on the HUVA thing, I can get back on this app later and try to answer that. Question here from Jack Brand. Who determines the safe zone of falling debris? I'm not sure. I would think it's the FAA or the FAA in concert with the operator. But I'm going to say the FAA. There's commercial launch rules, regulations that are written by the FAA. And I'm going to presume that those rules are there, and they're probably based on stuff that they inherited from NASA, from when NASA was doing launches. They probably all the knowledge of how you define those probably comes from NASA, and I'm guessing, emphasis on guessing here, probably just got incorporated by the FAA. But the folks who regulate commercial space flights are the FAA. Okay, that probably brings us very close to the end of this. I'll do the refresh one more time. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So, and we're just about at 3:40 here, or 12:40 your time in San Diego. So again, I'll thank everybody once again. Thank you very much for tuning in.